The judge has delivered the verdict in the Hamilton versus Toto Wolff case, and Toto will have to compensate Hamilton with $500,000. Stay until the end to get all the details of the ruling. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The courtroom erupted in a frenzy of whispers, gasps, and hastily exchanged glances the moment the verdict was read. The tension that had gripped the entire Formula One world for months had finally reached its boiling point, and the shockwave that followed the judge's ruling sent tremors through every corner of the sport. Lewis Hamilton had won. Against all odds, against a corporate giant, against a team that had once stood as an unshakable fortress of power and precision, Hamilton had emerged victorious in one of the most controversial, high-profile, and era-defining legal battles in the history of motorsport. As the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, delivering the final blow to Mercedes-AMG Petronas Formula One team's defense, all eyes turned to Toto Wolff. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration as the architect of Mercedes' F1 dominance now sat motionless, his normally unreadable expression betraying the weight of the ruling. The judgment was clear, the punishment swift, Euro 500,000 in damages and compensation, personally charged to Wolff himself. Not the team, not the shareholders, not the sponsors. Him. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The magnitude of the ruling cannot be overstated. This was not just about money. This was not a mere contractual dispute between a driver and his former employer. This was a war fought on principle, on legacy, on the fundamental ethics of Formula One's most dominant team. Hamilton had taken a stand against a system that for decades had operated in the shadows, where contracts could be manipulated, where financial settlements could be strategically sidestepped, where even the biggest names in the sport could be cast aside without consequence. But this time, there were consequences. This time, there was accountability. This time, there was a reckoning. The case had begun months ago in secrecy, shrouded in quiet legal maneuvering and behind-the-scenes negotiations. At first, Mercedes had tried to contain it. They had attempted to bury it under layers of corporate rhetoric, legal loopholes, and empty reassurances. But Hamilton's team was relentless. They had built a case so ironclad, so meticulously detailed, that every attempt at deflection only dug Mercedes deeper into the pit of their own making. The argument was simple yet damning. A key indemnification clause, written into Hamilton's exit agreement, had been willfully ignored by the Mercedes board, a breach that was not just financial but deeply personal. That clause, once considered a minor formality in a labyrinthine contract, became the smoking gun. It was the safeguard Hamilton's legal team had fought for when negotiating his departure, a legally binding guarantee that the team would honor the full scope of financial obligations owed to him. But instead of honoring that agreement, Mercedes chose to delay, deny, and ultimately dismiss Hamilton's claims. They thought they could outmaneuver him. They thought they could wear him down with bureaucracy, force him into a quiet settlement, make the problem disappear before the world caught wind of it. But Hamilton did not back down. He did not waver. He went to war. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. Inside the courtroom, the trial was a spectacle unlike anything the sport had ever seen. The prosecution, led by some of the most formidable legal minds in international sports litigation, tore through Mercedes' defense with merciless precision. Witnesses were called, former team members, contract lawyers, financial analysts, all testifying to the undeniable fact that Hamilton's contract had been violated in a manner that was not accidental, but intentional. Emails were presented. Internal communications, once thought to be hidden forever, exposed the conversations that had taken place within the highest levels of the team's management. Messages that discussed Hamilton's departure in cold, calculating business terms. Discussions about minimizing financial exposure and navigating contractual liabilities painted a picture of a team that had seen Hamilton's exit not as the departure of a legend, but as a financial inconvenience to be managed. Hamilton himself took the stand in what became the defining moment of the trial. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I gave everything to this team," he said. "Not just my time, not just my talent, but my name, my reputation, my legacy. I didn't just drive their cars, I built their empire. And when it was time for them to uphold their end of the deal, they turned their backs on me." His words hung in the air like a final judgment. There was no need for dramatics, no need for embellishments. The truth was enough. Mercedes' defense collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Their attempts to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a mere oversight were shattered by the brutal clarity of facts. By the time the final arguments were made, the outcome was clear. The judge's ruling was swift, decisive, and unflinching. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. And so, the verdict was delivered. Hamilton had won. Wolff, once untouchable, was now personally liable for €500,000, a sum that, while insignificant to his wealth, stood as a symbolic punishment, a mark of personal failure, a stain that could never be erased. The reaction was immediate. The Mercedes camp, stunned into silence, refused to make an immediate statement. Their PR team scrambled, their legal advisors whispered frantically, their entire structure of power shaken to its foundation. Hamilton, however, walked out of the courtroom with the composure of a man who had not just won a case, but a battle for justice. "This wasn't just about me," he told reporters, his words carrying the weight of a champion who had fought not just for himself, but for every driver who had ever been wronged by the politics of the sport. This was about fairness, about accountability, about making sure that contracts, that promises, mean something. Today, that was proven. The fallout from the ruling is still unfolding, but its implications are already sending shockwaves through the paddock. Teams are scrambling to re-evaluate their contractual obligations. Drivers are reassessing their legal protections. Sponsors are questioning their affiliations with Mercedes in the wake of this scandal. This was not just another lawsuit. This was a reckoning. A landmark case that could reshape the legal landscape of Formula One forever. And Mercedes? They are left with a legacy tarnished. A dynasty that once stood unchallenged now carries a scar that will never fully heal. Their greatest driver, their most celebrated champion, did not just leave them. He defeated them. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The world is watching. The dust is still settling. But one truth has emerged from this chaos, undeniable and absolute. Formula One will never be the same again. For Lewis Hamilton, this was never just about the money. It was never about the millions of euros that Mercedes was now desperately trying to withhold, nor about the financial compensation that had been promised to him in black and white. This was about something far deeper, something far more personal. It was about principle, about fairness, about integrity. It was about ensuring that no driver, present or future, would ever be subjected to the same ruthless treatment, the same cold and calculated betrayal that he now found himself fighting against. This was no longer just a legal dispute. This was a battle for justice, a battle to expose the truth behind the polished facade of the team that had once claimed to be his family. And in the courtroom, that truth was beginning to unravel in the most spectacular way imaginable. The proceedings had begun with the usual formalities, legal representatives from both sides laying out their cases, Mercedes lawyers attempting to downplay the severity of the dispute, Hamilton's team meticulously dissecting the contract to prove their argument. But everything changed the moment Hamilton himself took the stand. He had been quiet until then, watching, waiting, letting the evidence speak for itself. But when his time came, when the judge finally allowed him to tell his side of the story, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted completely. With a controlled but unmistakable fire in his voice, Hamilton detailed the years he had spent dedicating himself to Mercedes, pouring his soul into the team, sacrificing everything to help build them into an unstoppable force. He spoke of the moments that defined their era of dominance, the countless victories, the hard-fought championships, the late nights in the simulator, the endless meetings, the sacrifices that had been made behind the scenes, the loyalty he had shown through the toughest of times. And then, with an intensity that made the entire room hold its breath, he described the moment that loyalty was shattered. "They made me feel like family," he stated, his voice unwavering, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "They told me that I was part of something bigger, that we were in this together. And yet, when the time came for them to honor what was written in black and white, suddenly, I was no longer their priority. Suddenly, my contributions didn't matter anymore. That's not how you treat someone who gave you everything." The weight of his words sent a visible shockwave through the room. Even Mercedes' legal team, hardened professionals who had been tasked with dismantling Hamilton's case, seemed momentarily shaken. Some avoided eye contact, others shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, fully aware of the damage that had just been done. The judge himself, who had remained neutral throughout the proceedings, was now leaning forward, clearly engrossed in what was unfolding. Hamilton's legal representatives wasted no time in reinforcing the impact of his testimony. They presented an overwhelming amount of evidence: emails, internal messages, documents that left no room for ambiguity. The indemnification clause was not just a vague promise, not just a handshake agreement. It was a legally binding contract, one that had been signed and approved by every necessary party, including Toto Wolff himself. Mercedes' attempts to argue otherwise were crumbling before their eyes. And then came the moment that turned the entire trial on its head. A leaked internal memo, one that had somehow made its way into Hamilton's legal team's possession, was introduced as evidence. The document, written mere weeks after Hamilton had announced his departure, contained a direct strategy discussion among Mercedes' top executives about how to quietly maneuver around the contractual obligation, about how to reframe the situation in the media, about how to shift the narrative in their favor so that any legal pushback would appear to be nothing more than a misinterpretation of terms. It was, in no uncertain terms, proof of a deliberate attempt to deceive Hamilton. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, hurried whispers, shocked expressions. No one, not even Hamilton's fiercest critics, had expected something this damning to come to light. Even Mercedes' own lawyers looked rattled, their carefully crafted arguments now hanging by a thread. Toto Wolff, who had been present for every day of the trial but had remained stone-faced throughout, was now visibly tense. His usually unshakable demeanor, his carefully measured expressions, were faltering under the weight of the evidence that had just been thrown onto the table. He knew, they all knew, that there was no talking their way out of this now. Hamilton, however, remained composed. He had anticipated this. He had prepared for this. He had known from the very beginning that this was never going to be an easy fight, that Mercedes would do everything in their power to protect their own interests, to shield themselves from the repercussions of their own actions. But he had also known something else. He had the truth on his side. And the truth was undeniable. The following hours were a masterclass in legal obliteration. Mercedes' team scrambled to contain the damage, attempting to shift blame onto lower-level executives, arguing that the memo was taken out of context, that it did not represent an official stance from the team. But the judge was no longer interested in their justifications. His patience had run out. When the final arguments were made, when both sides had presented everything they had, the verdict was inevitable. Mercedes had knowingly breached their contractual obligations. They had engaged in a deliberate attempt to withhold payments that were legally owed to Hamilton. And now they would be forced to pay. The ruling was swift, brutal, and utterly humiliating for Mercedes. Not only were they ordered to provide Hamilton with a full indemnification package, every last cent that had been agreed upon, but they were also slapped with an additional fine for their attempt to manipulate the contract's terms. But more than the money, more than the financial victory, it was the symbolism of the ruling that truly mattered. Hamilton had won. Not just in court, but in the eyes of the entire world. Mercedes, the once mighty powerhouse, had been publicly exposed, their integrity shattered, their attempts to rewrite history thwarted in the most spectacular way possible. And while they would undoubtedly attempt to move on, to bury the scandal, to shift focus back to their on-track performances, the damage had already been done. Hamilton, the man they had tried to silence, had emerged from the battle not only victorious but more respected than ever. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in his direction, he did not gloat. He did not revel in their downfall. Instead, he simply smiled. Because he knew, just as the entire world now knew, he had fought for what was right. And he had won. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as the judge delivered the final ruling, a decision so unprecedented, so damning, that it sent immediate shockwaves not just through the motorsport world, but through the entire global sporting community. The verdict was clear, unambiguous, and delivered with a level of authority that left no room for debate. Mercedes had failed in its legal obligation to Lewis Hamilton, breaching a contract that had been designed to protect him, attempting to sidestep financial responsibilities that were rightfully his. But the true bombshell was not just the ruling itself, it was the weight of accountability placed squarely on the shoulders of one man, Toto Wolff. In an extraordinary, almost unheard-of move, the judge ruled that Wolff, as the highest-ranking executive responsible for overseeing Hamilton's contractual negotiations, bore personal responsibility for ensuring the financial commitments were met. This wasn't just a corporate fine levied against Mercedes as an organization. This was personal. This was Wolff being held directly, individually accountable in a way that no team principal in Formula One history had ever been before. The court had determined that his role in the failed payments was not just negligence, but a fundamental breach of professional duty. And then, the hammer fell. Wolff was ordered to personally compensate Hamilton with a €500,000 settlement, to be paid immediately. Not the team. Not Daimler. Him. For a figure as powerful, as meticulously composed as Toto Wolff, the ruling was nothing short of catastrophic. The very idea that a man who had shaped one of the greatest dynasties in Formula One could be singled out, personally forced to bear financial responsibility for a contractual dispute with his former driver, sent an uncontainable ripple effect through the industry. The precedent this ruling set was staggering. If a team principal could now be held personally accountable for financial mismanagement within their organization, what would stop similar cases from emerging in the future? Every driver, every high-profile contract negotiation, every team principal in the paddock was now looking at this case and realizing that the entire landscape of power in Formula One had just shifted. And yet, for all the magnitude of the ruling, for all the legal ramifications and the extraordinary precedent it set, it was Hamilton's response that took the world by storm. In a moment that cemented his legacy beyond racing, beyond championship titles, beyond statistics and accolades, Hamilton took to the press, standing before the cameras, his expression unreadable. The reporters expected anger, vindication, maybe even satisfaction. But what they got was something entirely different. Calm, composed, but with an unmistakable fire in his voice, Hamilton addressed the world. "I didn't fight this battle for money," he began, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I fought it because I was misled. Because I was made to feel like I didn't matter. Because people in powerful positions think they can get away with things like this. That's not the sport I believe in. That's not the future I want for the next generation of drivers." The silence in the room was deafening. No one moved. No one interrupted. Every journalist, every camera, every fan watching from their screens around the world hung onto his words. "So, if I can take this win and turn it into something positive, then that's exactly what I'm going to do." And then, the moment that shattered expectations. "Every penny of this settlement is going to a cancer research foundation. Because this fight wasn't about me, it was about something bigger." The room erupted. The headlines exploded. Social media detonated with reaction. News stations, sports commentators, analysts, former drivers, everyone was scrambling to process what had just happened. In a matter of seconds, Hamilton had transformed a personal legal victory into an unquestionable act of defiance, generosity, and leadership. This was no longer just a lawsuit. This was a movement. And while Mercedes scrambled behind the scenes to manage the fallout, Wolff himself was left reeling. For years, he and Hamilton had built something extraordinary together. A bond that transcended the usual driver-team principal relationship. They had won together, suffered together, shaped history together. And now? Now their names were forever linked in the most unexpected, public, and damaging way possible. And as much as Wolff tried to maintain composure, as much as he insisted in private circles that the ruling was unjust, that it had spiraled beyond what he had ever imagined, there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. His name, his personal name, was now attached to a financial penalty against one of the greatest drivers in the sport's history. And worse? The world had turned against him. The backlash was immediate and relentless. Sponsors, corporate partners, and stakeholders within Mercedes were furious. They had backed Wolff for years, trusted him implicitly, allowed him near total control over the team's operations. And yet, here they were, blindsided by a courtroom loss that had not only cost them financially but had also damaged the Mercedes brand in ways that no failed season, no driver dispute, no technical error ever had before. Questions arose, serious, urgent questions about Wolff's leadership, about how this situation had been allowed to escalate, about whether Mercedes' dominance had begun to crumble, not because of on-track performance, but because of off-track mismanagement. Some within the company, those who had quietly questioned Wolff's increasing control over the team, began to whisper that perhaps his time at the helm should come to an end. Could he survive this? Could he rebuild his credibility after such a public defeat? Hamilton, meanwhile, had already moved forward. In a move that could only be described as poetic justice, the very same week that the lawsuit's ruling dominated global headlines, Hamilton made another major announcement. His partnership with Red Bull Racing was now entering final negotiations. If the courtroom ruling had been a bombshell, this was the nuclear detonation that no one saw coming. Hamilton, victorious in court, poised to receive his settlement, donating it entirely to charity, was now potentially walking into the rival team that had spent years trying to dethrone Mercedes. The betrayal Mercedes felt when he first left was nothing compared to this. The chaos that followed was unparalleled. Hamilton's victory wasn't just legal, it was moral. He had fought for justice, won, and instead of keeping the money, had turned it into something greater. He had exposed the power structures in Formula One, shown the world that even the most untouchable figures in the sport could be held accountable, and now? Now, he was about to sign with the very team that Mercedes had fought against for over a decade. The ultimate shift in power. The paddock was in flames. The rumors were uncontrollable. The tension within Mercedes was insurmountable. Wolff, once the most unshakable figure in Formula One management, was now vulnerable. And Hamilton? Hamilton was in control. The war between driver and team had reached its conclusion. But the fallout? The ripple effects of this battle? They were just beginning. The courtroom erupted. A wave of applause, cheers, and even a few emotional tears swept through the gallery as Lewis Hamilton stood firm, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. His supporters, legal team, and even members of the press who had been granted access to the trial rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. It was a moment that transcended the immediate legal battle, a moment that solidified Hamilton's place not just as a driver, but as a symbol of integrity, of resilience, of unwavering commitment to fairness in a sport where loyalty was often just another bargaining chip. Within seconds, the outside world was set ablaze. News outlets scrambled to push breaking news alerts. Social media ignited like wildfire, hashtags such as #JusticeForLewis, #Champion on and off the track, and #Hamilton wins again dominating global trends within minutes. Fans flooded Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit with messages of support, videos of the moment being shared at an astronomical rate, reactions pouring in from every corner of the world. It was no longer just about a courtroom battle, it had become a cultural moment, a statement that extended beyond motorsport and into the realms of justice, corporate ethics, and the power struggle between drivers and the institutions that govern their careers. Meanwhile, in the paddock, a very different kind of reaction was taking shape. Within the cold, calculating corridors of Mercedes headquarters, an eerie silence hung in the air. The ruling had been a devastating blow, not just financially, but reputationally. The empire that Toto Wolff had built, the precision-engineered, meticulously run operation that had dominated the hybrid era, was now facing one of its darkest moments. This wasn't just a legal loss, this was a public relations disaster. And then finally, after weeks of speculation, after sitting silently as the world dissected every aspect of the trial, after letting Mercedes' legal team take the lead in their failed defense, Toto Wolff spoke. But he didn't do it in a press conference. He didn't do it through an official team statement. Instead, an anonymous leak, one that every major journalist covering the case immediately recognized as coming from within Wolff's inner circle, surfaced across multiple media platforms. It was calculated, deliberate, carefully worded to sound remorseful without fully admitting defeat. This was a misunderstanding, nothing more, Wolff reportedly claimed. If I had known that the indemnification payment had been left unsettled, I would have ensured it was handled immediately. There was no malicious intent, no desire to deny Lewis what was his. It was a miscommunication within the team's financial structure, and it spiraled into something that should never have happened. I regret that it ended up in court, and I regret that Lewis felt he needed to take this route to get what he deserved. But I want to be clear, this was never intentional. The reaction was immediate and divided. To some, it was an attempt at damage control, a last-ditch effort to salvage a relationship that had already been irreparably broken. To others, it was a weak excuse, an attempt to shift blame onto faceless accountants and financial managers rather than accept responsibility at the highest level. Hamilton's camp, however, saw it for what it truly was, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The damage was already done. The trust was shattered. And Mercedes? They were now on the defensive like never before. The fallout was catastrophic. Major sponsors, brands that had stood alongside Mercedes for years, pouring hundreds of millions into their championship-winning campaigns, were suddenly re-evaluating their commitments. Some had already begun internal discussions about distancing themselves from the controversy, afraid that the association with a team caught in a public dispute with a driver as influential as Hamilton could cause long-term reputational harm. Others, particularly those with corporate social responsibility initiatives tied to diversity and fairness in sport, were livid. This is not what we signed up for, an anonymous executive from one of Mercedes' largest commercial partners reportedly told a journalist. We backed this team because of its values, because of what it stood for. Now we have to ask ourselves if that still holds true. And it wasn't just external partners expressing concern. Within the team, divisions were forming. Some of Mercedes' most senior engineers, many of whom had been with the team through its golden era, were furious. They had built their careers on a culture of excellence, of discipline, of professionalism. The very idea that the team's internal structures had failed so catastrophically, that something as vital as an indemnification payment to one of their greatest ever drivers had slipped through the cracks, was unacceptable. This should have never happened. One longtime Mercedes technical director allegedly ranted to a colleague. "We lost Hamilton because of this mess. Do you understand how insane that is? Do you realize what this means for our future?" That future, once so certain, was now anything but. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. Because while Mercedes scrambled to contain the fallout, while Wolff worked behind the scenes to reassure sponsors, to keep the team from fracturing further, to salvage whatever was left of their reputation, another force was watching. Red Bull. They had already been in talks with Hamilton's camp, whispering behind the scenes, planting the seeds of what could be the most shocking transfer in F1 history. And now? Now they smelled blood in the water. Hamilton had won his legal battle. He had walked away with his legacy intact, his reputation stronger than ever. And yet, his next move remained a mystery. He was supposed to be at Ferrari, was supposed to be preparing for the biggest challenge of his career, bringing a title back to Maranello after more than a decade of disappointment. But now, a new offer had landed on his table. A $60 million contract from Red Bull. A deal that would put him in the most dominant car of the last 3 years. A deal that would see him replace his greatest rival, Max Verstappen, in a move that would send the sport into absolute chaos. A deal that could redefine the entire balance of power in Formula One. Could he say no? Would he? The entire motorsport world was now holding its breath. Every team principal, every sponsor, every rival on the grid, all waiting for the moment when Hamilton would make his decision. Would he stay with Ferrari and honor his commitment? Would he turn his back on everything he had fought for, everything he had promised to build in Maranello, and instead step into the cockpit of the most dominant machine in the sport's history? Or, perhaps most dangerously of all, was there another move still lurking in the shadows, one that no one saw coming? Because while the world was fixated on the battle between Hamilton, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull, an even greater power struggle was taking shape beneath the surface. A struggle that had the potential to change not just this season, but the entire trajectory of the sport. One thing was certain: Formula One was no longer just about racing. This was a game of power, of influence, of high-stakes political warfare. And the moment the lights went out on the first race of the season, nothing in the sport would ever be the same again. His carefully worded statement, polished by Mercedes' elite public relations team and delivered with an air of forced confidence, did little to quell the firestorm that had engulfed the sport. To many, it was nothing more than damage control, a feeble attempt to contain the fallout from a legal battle that had already done irreparable damage to both his own credibility and Mercedes' once impenetrable reputation. The carefully chosen words, the diplomatic tone, the insistence that it was all a misunderstanding, none of it convinced the skeptics, the analysts, the fans who had watched in disbelief as one of the most dominant partnerships in Formula One history collapsed in a courtroom instead of on the racetrack. Critics, both within the paddock and beyond, tore apart Wolff's justification, dissecting every phrase, every subtle deflection, every attempt to absolve himself of responsibility. How could a team principal, the man at the helm of a billion-dollar operation, the architect of an empire that had ruled the sport for nearly a decade, claim ignorance when it came to the financial obligations owed to the very driver who had built that empire alongside him? How could Mercedes, a team known for its meticulous precision, allow a legal dispute of this magnitude to escalate to the point where their most decorated driver had to take them to court just to receive what was rightfully his? To many, the mere fact that this case had even reached trial was proof that Mercedes had made every possible effort to delay, deflect, and diminish their financial responsibilities, until they were left with no other option but to fight a losing battle in front of the world. The fallout from this unprecedented trial is far from over. The damage done to Mercedes is not just financial, it is reputational, cultural, existential. This is not the kind of scandal that fades away with time. This is not something that a few good race results will erase. This is a stain on their legacy, a permanent mark on the record of a team that once prided itself on dominance, loyalty, and honor. The legal ramifications alone are staggering. Contracts, once considered ironclad, are now being scrutinized like never before. Legal experts, industry analysts, and team executives have already begun to pick apart every detail of the ruling, dissecting its implications for future driver negotiations. Some believe this case will reshape the very structure of Formula One contracts, forcing teams to be more transparent, more accountable, more legally bound to the promises they make to their drivers. Others worry that this verdict will set a precedent that could open the floodgates for similar disputes in the future. Drivers challenging their teams, financial clauses being rewritten, legal battles becoming just as important as on-track rivalries. And then, there is the question of Mercedes' future. A team that once had its pick of the grid, that could attract any driver with the promise of championship-winning machinery and unwavering support, now finds itself under intense scrutiny. Will the next generation of F1 stars, the young talents dreaming of world titles, trust that Mercedes will honor its commitments? Will the biggest names in the sport, those with options, those with leverage, hesitate before signing a contract with a team that was just dragged through a courtroom by the very driver who made them great? And beyond that, what of the sponsors, the investors, the multinational corporations whose billions have powered Mercedes' dominance? Formula One is not just a sport, it is a business, a political chessboard, a world driven by money, influence, and reputation. And in a sport where perception is everything, Mercedes has taken a blow that no amount of clever marketing can undo. But while Mercedes licks its wounds, while the legal teams wrap up the final details, while Wolff and his executives scramble to repair the wreckage, one man stands taller than ever. Lewis Hamilton. The victor. The man who stood against one of the most powerful organizations in motorsport and won. The driver who, even after being forced into a battle he never wanted, walks away with his integrity intact, his reputation strengthened, his resolve fiercer than ever. If there was any doubt before, if anyone believed that Hamilton's best days were behind him, that his motivation had waned, that his fire had dimmed, those doubts have now been obliterated. He is more dangerous, more relentless, more determined than ever. Because the legal war may be over, but Hamilton's true battle is only just beginning. With the courtroom behind him, his focus now shifts entirely to the racetrack, to Ferrari, to the challenge ahead, to the one thing he craves more than anything else, an 8th world championship. And make no mistake, he is coming for it. There is an energy around him now, a sense of renewed purpose, an aura of unfinished business. He has been wronged. He has been forced to fight for what was his. And now, with nothing standing in his way, with the legal distractions erased, he is ready to make his statement where it truly matters, on the track in the heat of battle, against the very team that tried to cast him aside. There is no greater revenge than winning. And that is precisely what Hamilton intends to do. Mercedes may have been his past, but Ferrari is his future. A team that has spent over a decade in the wilderness, longing for a return to the top, now has its greatest weapon. A driver with something to prove, a champion with a fire that refuses to burn out, a warrior who has just survived the most brutal fight of his career and emerged even stronger. Ferrari sees what the world sees, a man reborn, a competitor more driven than ever, an icon stepping into the most important chapter of his story. The Scuderia knows that if there was ever a moment to strike, to reclaim their place at the summit of the sport, it is now. And they have the driver who can deliver it. The 2025 season is no longer just another campaign. It is a reckoning. It is Hamilton's opportunity to rewrite the ending of his story, to dismantle the very team that tried to bring him down, to stand atop the podium wearing Ferrari red and send a message so deafening that it echoes across the sport. And in the paddock, the tension is unbearable. The media is already feeding off the spectacle, turning every glance between Hamilton and his former team into a headline, every word spoken in the garages into a subplot. The drama is only just beginning, and with every passing day, the anticipation grows. Because this is not just another title fight. This is vengeance. This is a battle for history. This is Lewis Hamilton, unleashed. And Formula One will never be the same again.